Right now, preppers are quietly clearing specific shelves at grocery stores across the country. Not rice, not beans, not the obvious stuff everyone tells you to grab. Something else, 25 specific foods. And if you walked past those shelves today, you would have no idea anything was wrong, because they still look mostly stocked. That is exactly how these shortages begin. Here is what most people do not know. Multiple major grocery chains, grocery outlet, Save-A-Lot, and locations inside Kroger's own network among them have announced closures throughout this year alone. And the USDA already counts more than 17 million Americans living in neighborhoods without reliable access to a full grocery store. But the store's closing is not the real problem. The real problem is what is disappearing from the ones still open, and why it is not coming back at the same price, or in some cases, at all. One item on this list has traded at record highs in the same year you are watching this. Another has a shelf life of 3,000 years, and it is still getting harder to find in large quantities. By the end of this video, you will know all 25, the real reason behind each one, and what to actually do about it this week. This list was not put together by guessing. Every item on it is here because of a specific, checkable pressure sitting behind the price tag right now, a drought in one growing region, a disease wiping out one specific crop or flock, a packaging cost climbing across an entire industry, not a vague feeling that things are getting worse. Some of these pressures are easing this year. Others are actively getting worse as you watch this. Both kinds are on this list because both kinds change what is sitting on the shelf in front of you. Let's go. Number 25. Black pepper and vanilla. Both come from a tiny handful of growing regions. Vietnam for pepper, Madagascar for the vast majority of the world's natural vanilla. And both have spent the last few years lurching between shortage and glut, as weather, cyclones, and replanting cycles swing supply wildly in either direction. When either region has a bad season, the entire global spice aisle feels it within months, because there is no meaningful backup supplier waiting in the wings. Buy the real thing in bulk when you see it priced normally, because normal pricing on either of these has not been something you can count on lasting. Both also store for years in a sealed container away from light and heat, so there is no real downside to buying more than one trip's worth once you find a fair price. Number 24. Granulated sugar. Global sugar prices swing hard on decisions made thousands of miles from any American grocery store. Export restrictions out of India. Weather in Brazil's cane fields, and how much of that Brazilian crop gets diverted into ethanol instead of your pantry in a given year. A staple that used to be an afterthought on the shopping list has quietly become something worth watching and buying ahead of, especially in the large bags that give you real cost efficiency. It also happens to be one of the easiest ingredients in the world to store correctly, kept dry and sealed. Sugar essentially does not spoil, which makes it one of the lowest risk items on this entire list to buy well ahead of need. Number 23. Wheat flour. Flour sits at the bottom of an enormous number of shelf-stable foods, bread, pasta, baking mixes, and its price is tied directly to the global wheat market. A market that has stayed volatile for years now on the back of conflict, weather, and shifting export policy in a handful of major growing nations. When wheat gets expensive, everything built on top of it gets expensive a few weeks later. Stocking a rotation of flour is one of the simplest, cheapest hedges against that entire chain reaction, and combined with a working supply of yeast later in this list. It is the difference between an empty bread aisle mattering to your household and not mattering at all. Number 22, dried pasta. This one rides on the same wheat pressure as flour, but with an added regional twist, a meaningful share of the durum wheat used. For higher-end pasta comes from growing regions in Italy and Canada that have both dealt with serious drought stress in recent seasons. Pasta already has one of the longest shelf lives in any pantry, 2 years or more in a sealed box, which makes it one of the easiest items on this entire list to simply buy extra of on a normal shopping trip. It is also one of the most versatile calorie sources you can store, taking on almost any sauce, oil or seasoning you have on hand, which matters more than people expect once variety starts running thin. Number 21. Powdered coffee creamer. This one gets overlooked because it feels like a small, disposable convenience item, but it sits at the intersection of two pressured commodities at once: dairy and vegetable oil, both of which show up elsewhere on this exact list. When either input spikes, creamer reformulates or shrinks in package size before most shoppers ever notice, and unlike fresh dairy, the powdered version stores for well over a year without refrigeration. It is a small item that most households buy without thinking twice, which is exactly why it is worth watching. Because small, unnoticed items are usually the first ones, a manufacturer quietly shrinks or reformulates when costs climb. Number 20. Canned corn and mixed vegetables. Remember the packaging problem, driving up the cost of canned tomato paste, steel and aluminum prices climbing across the board. That same pressure sits underneath every canned vegetable on the shelf, not just tomato products and low-margin items like. Plain canned corn are exactly the kind of product a manufacturer quietly trims first when a production run gets expensive. They are also one of the few genuinely shelf-stable sources of vegetable nutrition, once fresh produce becomes harder to get consistently. And unlike frozen vegetables, they need no freezer space and survive a power outage without spoiling. Number 19. Maple syrup. Real maple syrup depends on a narrow seasonal window, cold nights and warmer days in late winter that get the sap flowing in sugar maples across the American Northeast and Quebec. Warmer winters have been shortening and destabilizing that window year over year, which means the supply behind a jug of real syrup is tied directly to a climate pattern nobody can control. It is expensive already, and the trend line on that narrow tapping season is not pointing toward it getting cheaper. Properly sealed and stored in a cool spot, it lasts for years, so a bottle bought this season is not a gamble. It is simply locking in a supply from a harvest that is only getting less predictable. Number 18. Powdered milk. This is the deep pantry cousin of the evaporated milk further down this list, dairy that has been dried down almost entirely, which pushes its shelf life out past a decade in the right container. Dairy pricing has been genuinely volatile for several years running, and unlike a jug of fresh milk, a sealed can or pouch of powdered milk sitting in a cool pantry is not racing against an expiration date measured in days. It reconstitutes with plain water in seconds and works fine in coffee, baking and cooking, which makes it one of the most quietly useful items on this entire list, rather than just an emergency backup nobody ever touches. Number 17. Peanut butter. Peanuts are a genuinely weather-sensitive crop, concentrated in a handful of growing regions across the American Southeast, and a hot, dry season there translates directly into a smaller harvest and a higher price at the jar a few months later. It is also one of the single densest sources of shelf-stable protein and fat available in an ordinary grocery store, which makes it one of the highest value additions to a food reserve per dollar spent, not just one more item to stock for the sake of stocking it. A sealed jar also keeps for a year or more in a normal pantry, so there is little reason not to have a few extras waiting behind the one currently open. Number 16. Frozen orange juice concentrate. Florida's citrus industry has been fighting a disease called citrus greening for years, an infection that has no cure, and has already cut the state's orange harvest down to a fraction of what it produced a generation ago. Most of the orange juice concentrate that used to come from domestic groves increasingly does not, and the supply squeeze behind it is not a weather event that passes in a season. It is a slow-moving agricultural crisis with no real fix on the horizon. Frozen concentrate in the can, not the ready-to-pour carton, is the format that actually stores for the long haul, staying good in a freezer for a year or more, well past what fresh juice or even the refrigerated carton can offer. Number 15. Canned chicken and other shelf-stable canned meats. This is the plain, unglamorous protein source that rarely gets attention until the fresh meat case looks thin, and it belongs on this list precisely because it is boring. Boring items are exactly the ones manufacturers deprioritize first when a production line gets squeezed by rising costs elsewhere in the supply chain. A case of it sitting in the back of a pantry does more for a household's actual food security than almost anything else on this list, simply because it is a complete protein that needs no refrigeration and no cooking skill to use. Straight from the can, it is already a meal. Mixed into rice, pasta, or a pot of beans, it becomes several. Number 14. Powdered eggs. Keep this one in mind next to the fresh egg crisis you're about to hear about, because it is the long-term answer to the exact same problem. A sealed container of powdered egg stores for 5 to 10 years in a cool, dry space versus a few weeks for a fresh carton, and 1 pound of powder replaces roughly 75 whole eggs. When fresh egg prices spike the way they have repeatedly in recent years, the powdered version barely moves, because it was bought and packaged long before the outbreak that caused the spike ever happened. It works in baking and scrambles about as well as anyone actually needs it to, and for a household that eats eggs regularly. It is one of the single highest leverage items on this entire list relative to what it costs to store. Number 13. Coffee. This is one of the clearest, most measurable entries on the entire list. Coffee futures have hit record highs multiple times over the past 2 years, driven by severe drought and historic wildfire activity across Brazil's coffee-growing regions. Tens of thousands of individual fires in a single season, and a prolonged production slump in Vietnam, the world's largest source of Robusta beans. Prices have swung wildly month to month since, up to record levels, down by more than a third in a matter of weeks, then surging again almost as fast, which is the signature of a genuinely unstable supply, not a temporary blip. A market that volatile is not one you want to be relying on for a fresh delivery the exact week you need it most. If coffee matters to your household's morning routine, buying whole bean in bulk during any relative dip is a real hedge against a market that has shown no sign of settling down. Number 12. Cocoa and chocolate. Roughly 2/3 of the world's cocoa beans grow in just 2 neighboring countries, Ivory Coast and Ghana, and disease along with poor weather hit both of their harvests hard enough in recent years to create one of the largest global cocoa supply deficits on record. Chocolate prices followed immediately, with production costs for basic milk chocolate climbing by roughly half in a single year at the peak of it. Supply has eased somewhat since, and later harvests brought meaningfully more beans into port than the crisis year did, but prices remain well above where they sat only a few years ago. And that concentration in 2 neighboring countries means the entire global market stays one bad season away from another spike. Unopened chocolate and cocoa powder both keep for well over a year in a cool pantry, long enough to ride out at least one bad harvest cycle without ever noticing it at the register. Number 11. Olive oil. Spain produces close to half the world's olive oil, and a brutal multi-year drought across the Mediterranean cut its harvest dramatically, pushing prices to their highest level in more than 2 decades before a better rainy season finally brought some relief. That relief is fragile. The entire global supply still leans on weather in one region of one country, and the last drought proved exactly how fast. That can turn a pantry staple into a luxury item again, more than doubling in price within a couple of harvest seasons. Buying the large tins when prices are calm is simply buying insurance against the next dry year and unopened. Olive oil holds its quality for a year or more in a cool, dark cabinet, plenty long enough to outlast a bad season somewhere else in the Mediterranean. Number 10. Fresh eggs. Bird flu has torn through American egg-laying flocks repeatedly since 2022, wiping out tens of millions of birds at a time and sending the price of a dozen eggs to record highs more than once. Prices crash back down for a while after each outbreak gets contained, only for a fresh round of avian flu to hit a new region and start the entire cycle over again. Prices have already touched multiple record highs since 2025 alone, then fallen back sharply within the same year, only for a fresh outbreak somewhere else to start pushing them right back up again. That boom and bust pattern, not a single one-time event, is exactly why the powdered version earlier on this list is worth keeping in the pantry as a buffer between crashes. So a bad month for the flock does not have to mean a bad month for your breakfast. Number 9. Canned sardines and mackerel. A quality tin of sardines in olive oil that cost around $2 a few years ago now runs $4 or more at most retailers. A full doubling in a short stretch, and shelves in multiple regions are showing up partially stocked or bare on a recurring basis, not as a one-off. Fisheries have been cutting catch quotas as fish populations decline and warming oceans shift migration patterns, and that supply contraction is compounding with the same steady global demand it always had. Each can delivers dense protein, healthy fat, and omega-3 levels that rival dedicated fish oil supplements, a combination genuinely hard to replace from other shelf-stable sources once fresh fish is not an option. Go for the versions packed in olive oil specifically. The oil itself adds real calories and healthy fat to an already dense little can. And a properly stored tin holds its quality for 3 to 5 years without any real loss. Number 8. Canned tomato paste. 95% of the entire country's processed tomato supply grows in a single stretch of California's Central Valley, and that region is being squeezed from every direction at once. Tightened water access, rising labor costs, and the broader cost of farming in California, pushing smaller growers out of the business entirely. Because production is this concentrated, there is no real backup region to shift sourcing to when output drops. And rising steel and aluminum costs mean low-margin items like a small can of paste are often the first thing a manufacturer quietly cuts from a production run. Grocery workers describe back orders running 6 weeks or more, with new shipments selling out within hours of hitting the shelf. It is easy to underrate a small can of paste, but it is one of the few pantry items that genuinely transforms everything around it. Turning plain rice and beans into chili, canned vegetables into real soup, which matters far more once variety starts running thin than it does on an ordinary Tuesday. Number 7. Bulk yeast. Yeast production runs through a small number of highly specialized facilities that cannot simply scale up overnight, because it is a living organism that needs precise fermentation conditions at every stage. Home baking demand jumped in 2020 and never fully came back down, while production capacity mostly reverted to where it was before, leaving a structural gap between how much people want to bake and how much yeast the industry is actually set up to produce. A vacuum-sealed 1-pound block kept in the freezer stays fully viable for 5 years or more, the equivalent of over 60 ordinary packet strips, and without viable yeast, baking real bread from scratch simply is not an option. Ordinary retail packets kept at room temperature stay usable for about 6 months, refrigerated closer to a year. But the frozen vacuum-sealed block sits in an entirely different category, and the price per use drops dramatically once you are buying by the pound instead of the packet. Number 6. Cooking oil in large format containers. A 1-gallon jug of ordinary vegetable or canola oil that cost around $6 2 years ago now runs $12 to $14. More than double. And gallon jugs have gone completely missing from shelves at multiple chains on separate occasions, not just low in stock. Ukraine's disrupted sunflower exports, tightening restrictions on palm oil, and rising grain costs pushing up soybean oil prices are all stacking on top of each other with no clean resolution in sight. Dietary fat is not optional. The body needs it to absorb key vitamins and sustain hormone function, and most core pantry staples like rice. And beans contain almost none of it on their own, so a meal built without any real fat source will leave. A household running low on energy and focus within weeks, no matter how many calories it technically adds up to. Unopened and stored in a cool, dark spot, a jug of vegetable oil holds up for 1 to 2 years, which makes a slow rotation, buying one, using the oldest, easy to maintain without ever running dry. Number 5. Bulk bouillon. A cube the size of a sugar cube turns a cup of water into a cup of seasoned broth for pennies, roughly 40 times cheaper than the same volume from a can. And 200 cubes fit in a container the size of a shoebox instead of the shelf space dozens of heavy cans would take. Beyond the economics, bouillon is what turns plain rice, plain beans, and plain canned vegetables into an actual meal instead of the same flavorless food night after night, and that variety measurably protects morale during any extended stretch of limited eating. The bulk tubs of 200 cubes or more are getting genuinely hard to find, while the small retail boxes remain common but are not practical for building any real reserve. When you do find the bulk format, buy well past what looks reasonable, because the cost per serving is so low that even a large container represents one of the smallest dollar commitments on this entire list. Number 4. Shelf-stable bacon. Fully cooked, vacuum-sealed, no refrigeration required, and good for around 18 months on a shelf, this is real bacon that adds fat, calories, and an unmistakable mood-lifting aroma to meals built mostly from carbohydrate-heavy staples like rice and beans. Several brands that were reliably in stock little more than a year ago have quietly moved to backorder status or been discontinued outright. And when a manufacturer cannot give a straight answer about when a product is coming back, that usually means they genuinely do not know either. The taste is not identical to a fresh pan-cooked strip, nobody claims that, but the smell alone changes how a plain meal feels. And in a stretch of limited variety, that shift in mood is worth more than people expect until they are the ones living through it. Number 3. Canned butter. Real dairy butter sealed for long-term storage has sat quietly on farm supply store shelves for years, mostly invisible to ordinary shoppers, but demand has climbed sharply as more people learn it exists, while supply has taken direct hits. Only 3 companies manufacture it in the United States at real scale, and recently 2 of those 3 have been knocked down at once. One by a fire that cut output, the other by a shortage of the metal cans needed to package it at all. Stored cool, it holds real quality for 5 to 10 years, versus a few weeks for a stick in the refrigerator, which makes it one of the most dramatic shelf life upgrades on this entire list. One can typically holds the equivalent of a few standard sticks, and at current dairy prices, buying it today is not just about the shelf life. It is also a reasonable hedge against a dairy market that has already proven how fast it can move. Number 2. Evaporated milk in pull-tab cans. Shelves that once held full rows now show up partial or completely empty on a repeating cycle across multiple regions at once, because when a dairy processor is squeezed by costs or staffing, capacity goes first to fresh milk and cheese, the higher margin products, pushing a shelf-stable item like this toward the back of the production line. The pull tab format matters more than it sounds. Being able to open a can without hunting for a tool in a dark kitchen during a power outage is a real practical advantage, and with roughly 60% of its water removed, it delivers milk's protein in a more concentrated, longer-lasting form than the carton in your fridge ever could. It works in coffee, baking and soup without most people ever noticing the difference, and for households with kids or older relatives who rely on dairy for calcium and protein. A shelf-stable option that needs no refrigeration is worth more than its small price tag suggests. Number 1. Honey in large containers. This is the only food on this entire list that will never expire, not as a marketing claim, but as a matter of basic chemistry. Its low water content, acidity, and natural trace hydrogen peroxide together make bacterial growth essentially impossible. Archaeologists have pulled honey out of 3,000-year-old Egyptian tombs and found it still chemically intact and edible, a shelf life nothing else in your kitchen can touch. Even so, the large multi-pound containers that actually make sense for storage are getting harder to find at a reasonable price. Squeezed by declining honeybee colony productivity here at home and tighter import scrutiny abroad after years of cheap, adulterated honey flooding the market. Buy the big jugs while they are still on the shelf, because unlike almost everything else on this list, honey purchased today will be exactly as good 10 and 20 years from now, and beyond the kitchen, it doubles as a real wound dressing and a natural cough suppressant with genuine research behind both uses, which makes a large container one of the very few items on this list that pulls double duty outside the pantry entirely. Here is what ties all 25 of these together. Rice provides carbohydrates and almost no fat. Canned vegetables provide micronutrients and almost no protein. Beans provide protein but need fat and flavor to be sustainably edible night after night. Every single item on this list, from black pepper to honey, fills a specific gap that the obvious staples leave wide open. And that is exactly why this is not the list most people would think to build on their own. This is not a prediction of collapse, and it is not an argument for extreme stockpiling. It is a practical case for a modest, rotating reserve, built before the items on it get harder to find or more expensive to buy, which for several of them has already started happening in the same year you are watching this. Notice, too, that almost none of these 25 require a special trip or a specialty store. Every one of them is sitting on a shelf at the grocery store you already walk through every week, which is exactly why this kind of shortage is so easy to miss until the day it actually matters to you. On each of your next few shopping trips, add 2 or 3 items from this list to your cart. Nothing dramatic, nothing that strains a normal grocery budget, and within a handful of trips, you will have a real, usable buffer instead of an anxious afterthought. The households in the best position 6 months from now will not be the ones who react once the shelves are visibly bare and it is already on the news. They will be the ones who acted while the gaps were still small and easy to miss. Start with whichever 3 or 4 items on this list your own kitchen already runs through every month. Coffee, cooking oil, flour. Eggs in some form, because those are the ones a shortage will hit you with first, and they are also the easiest ones to simply buy 1 extra of every single trip without ever feeling like you are preparing for anything at all. That window is open right now. Which one of these 25 are you going to pick up first? Let me know in the comments.